The night my mother-in-law handed me a key to my own basement, she did it the way people hand things to valets. She didn't look at me. She was already mid-conversation with my wife, already laughing at something I hadn't heard, already occupying the kitchen I had gutted and rebuilt with my own 2 hands over the course of a single summer. She held the key out to the side, dangling it from 2 fingers, and waited for me to take it. I took it. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a face. I closed my fingers around that key the way you close your hand around a stone you intend to keep. I noted it, the way you note weather before a storm. That was the last time I would ever sleep beneath my own roof as a man who could be handed anything. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am a licensed structural engineer. For 19 years, I worked for a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio, and for 11 of those years I was the senior project lead on infrastructure contracts that collectively represented just over $340 million in completed work. I say that not to impress you. I say it because I need you to understand the kind of man who was handed a basement key. I bought the house on Ashford Lane in 2009. It was a foreclosure. 3 bedrooms, a cracked foundation, and a backyard that looked like a verdict. I spent 8 months fixing it before I let anyone inside. I replaced the sill plates myself. I repoured a section of the foundation on a rented machine. I installed the kitchen cabinets, the crown molding, the recessed lighting in the living room that my wife, her name was Renee, told every dinner guest she had found on Pinterest. I did not correct her. Renee and I married in 2011. She was warm then, quick to laugh. She taught 3rd grade and coached the school's spring musical and brought home other people's problems the way some people bring home stray animals, with total commitment and no plan for what came next. I loved that about her for a long time. What I did not love and should have studied more carefully was her relationship with her mother. Patricia Halloran was 63 years old when she first set foot in my house. She walked through every room the way a building inspector walks through a property, evaluating, cataloging, deciding what met code and what did not. She did not compliment the kitchen I had rebuilt. She asked why I hadn't chosen quartz for the countertops. I told her granite was more durable. She looked at Renee. That look. I want you to hold on to that look because it matters later. For 7 years, I told myself Patricia was difficult the way weather is difficult. Not malicious, just something you dressed for. I drove her to medical appointments when her hip was bad. I fixed her gutters in November on a ladder in 30-degree wind. I paid for the repair of her car twice without being asked and declined to be repaid both times. I was, by any reasonable measure, a good son-in-law. I was also, without realizing it, establishing a precedent. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. If you're new here, this is where composed men tell true stories about the moment they stopped being patient. Grab your coffee. Get comfortable. This one takes 19 years to build and about 45 minutes to dismantle completely. Patricia moved in on a Thursday in March of 2019. Renee had framed it as temporary. Her mother had sold her condo following a dispute with her HOA. A dispute, I would later learn, that Patricia had engineered through a sustained campaign of formal complaints against her neighbors until living there became mutually untenable. She needed somewhere to stay while she sorted things out. 6 weeks, Renee said. 8 at the outside. I want you to hold onto the phrase 8 at the outside because it matters later. I gave Patricia the guest room on the main floor. It was the nicest room in the house after the primary bedroom. South-facing windows, its own bathroom, a closet I had custom-fitted with adjustable shelving. I moved my home office equipment to a corner of the basement and set up a folding table. It was temporary. 6 weeks. The first shift happened inside of 10 days. I came home from a site visit on a Wednesday evening to find that the guest room had been rearranged. Patricia had moved the furniture, including a solid oak dresser that weighed approximately 160 pounds, into new positions. She had also removed the framed architectural prints I had hung on the wall and replaced them with a gallery of family photographs. Photographs that did not include me. I mentioned it to Renee that night. Quietly, calmly. She said her mother was just making it feel like home. I noted that, by week 4, Patricia had established what I can only describe as territorial dominance over the main floor of my house. She controlled the television remote with the quiet authority of someone who has never once considered that a remote control could belong to anyone else. She rearranged the pantry. She threw away 2 cast-iron skillets I had seasoned over a decade, describing them as rusty, and replaced them with a non-stick set from a discount store. She began referring to the kitchen as her kitchen. Not possessively, not dramatically, just casually, the way you refer to your car or your chair. I reorganized my kitchen today, she would say to Renee at dinner. Renee would nod. I would pass the bread. 6 weeks became 3 months. 3 months became 5. Renee stopped referencing a departure timeline. When I raised it, always gently, always in private, she would find a reason Patricia wasn't ready. Her hip, the housing market, a vague mention of stress. Each reason was plausible in isolation. Together they formed a wall. I didn't know it yet, but the wall was load-bearing. The basement arrangement began in month 6. It started with a request, again framed as temporary. Patricia's hip was troubling her and the stairs to the guest room were too much. Could she use the primary bedroom on the main floor while her mobility was limited? Just for a few weeks. I looked at Renee. Renee looked at the table. We moved to the master bedroom upstairs. It was smaller. The ensuite bathroom had a shower with inconsistent water pressure that I had never gotten around to fixing because I had never needed to use it. I fixed it now. I also noted, without comment, that Patricia's hip seemed to give her no trouble whatsoever when she wanted to walk to the neighbor's house for coffee. I noted everything. Month 8. The dynamic had calcified into something I could no longer charitably describe as a temporary arrangement. Patricia's presence was no longer a condition of the house. It was the condition of the house. She cooked when she chose to cook and ate when she chose to eat and made no accommodation for my schedule or my preferences or my existence in any form that could be called deliberate. What I did not know, what I would not know for another 4 months, was that something else had been calcifying alongside it. I came home early on a Tuesday in November. Renee didn't hear my car. I was in the entryway removing my boots when I heard it. Her voice, from the kitchen, low and unhurried. The way people speak when they are certain they are alone. He doesn't need to know everything, Mom. The attorney said we just need continuity of residence. I stood very still. The house is already in both names. She said if we can document that this has been the primary family residence for the full period, it strengthens the claim substantially. I want you to hold on to the word claim because it matters later. I put my boots back on. I went back to my car. I sat in my driveway for 22 minutes. I did not know everything yet, but I knew enough. I knew that whatever Renee was building, she had been building it in the same house I had poured the foundation of. I knew that Patricia was not a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She was infrastructure. She was, in the architecture of whatever plan my wife was executing, a load-bearing wall. And I knew something else. I knew that I was a structural engineer. I knew exactly how to remove a load-bearing wall. The dinner was Renee's idea. A small gathering, her sister Colleen, Colleen's husband Brad, Patricia, and a couple named the Ostranders who lived 2 streets over and whom Renee had recently befriended with an intensity one had attributed, at the time, to loneliness. I know now it was not loneliness. I grilled that evening.
Tri-tip, marinated overnight.
Roasted vegetables, homemade compound butter, a bottle of Malbec I had been saving. I set the table. I lit the candles. I was, as I had always been, a man who showed up completely for a room that was making plans he couldn't see. The conversation at dinner was warm, surface level, domestic. Brad talked about his fantasy football standings. Colleen talked about a renovation project they were considering. Mrs. Ostrander, first name Karen, which I note without editorial comment, was engaged and smiling throughout. And then, over dessert, the shift. I don't know what caused it. Perhaps it was the wine. Perhaps it had been planned. Perhaps the Ostranders were not neighbors who had wandered into our lives but witnesses Renee had positioned. All I know is that Karen Ostrander turned to Renee and asked, with the casual warmth of someone who has asked a question before, "So have you figured out the long-term situation with the house?" The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when a question is not actually a question. Renee set down her fork. Patricia leaned back slightly in her chair. And Renee said, and I will give you her exact words because some sentences deserve to be preserved in their original form. She said, "We're working on it. Daniel's name will probably need to come off eventually, but we're taking it slow." I looked up from my plate. Brad was looking at his wine glass. Colleen was looking at her lap. Patricia was looking directly at me with an expression I had seen once before, the expression of someone who has already won a game they never told you were playing. Karen Ostrander said, "Oh, that makes sense," and reached for the bread. I want you to understand what happened in my body in that moment. It was not rage. Rage is fire, and fire is visible, and visible is a concession. What happened was more like a pressure differential, the kind that happens in a structure when load is redistributed. When weight moves from one beam to another. Quiet. Architectural. Irreversible. I picked up my fork. I finished my dessert. I thanked Karen Ostrander for coming. I shook Brad's hand at the door. And after the last guest had driven away, and after Renee had gone upstairs, and after Patricia had made her tea and retreated to my bedroom, the bedroom I had bought and furnished and never meant to surrender, I sat at my kitchen table. In my house. At the table I had built. And I opened my laptop. I did not decide anything that night in the way people imagine decisions are made. There was no fist on the table. No confrontation in the hallway. No moment of cinematic rupture. The decision had already been forming for months, the way ice forms. Silently, below the surface, invisible until the moment you need to cross it and discover it will hold your weight. What I did that night was research. I typed the name of a family law attorney I had heard mentioned, tangentially professionally, by a colleague whose own divorce I had watched from a respectful distance 2 years prior. I found her website. I read her credentials. I sent a contact form inquiry at 11:47 p.m. She responded at 7:14 the following morning. Her name was Margaret Foss. She had 22 years of family law practice in Franklin County. She had a voice like someone who has heard every version of every story and retained the ability to be useful anyway. I met her at her office on a Thursday. I brought a folder. The folder contained 7 years of mortgage statements in my name, the original purchase agreement from 2009, photographs of the renovation work with dated metadata, the receipts from Patricia's car repairs, a written account of the conversation I had overheard in November, time-stamped, with the exact words as I had recorded them in a notes application on my phone within 4 minutes of returning to my car, and a printed copy of my direct deposit history demonstrating that I had been the sole consistent financial contributor to the household for the duration of our marriage. Margaret Foss opened the folder. She read it in silence. She closed it. She said, "Mr. Mercer, you have been very thorough." I told her I was an engineer. She smiled and said that explained it. I didn't know it yet, but that folder was the entire game. What Renee and Patricia had not accounted for, what I suspect they could not have accounted for, because they had never considered me a serious opponent, was that a man who rebuilds foundations for a living does not leave his documentation in disarray. Every financial record was clean. Every receipt was filed. Every contribution to that house was traceable, time-stamped, and legally attributable to me. Margaret Foss explained something to me that afternoon that I want to share with you now, because I think it is important. She said, "People who plan quietly often forget that the person they are planning against has been quietly watching." I drove home from that meeting and I cooked dinner. I set the table. I poured Renee's wine. I asked Patricia how her hip was feeling. That was the last time I would ever perform normalcy in that house. The filing happened 11 days later. Margaret Foss filed the petition on a Monday. I was on a site visit in Westerville when it happened, standing in a partially completed highway overpass, reviewing load calculations, watching concrete cure in the winter air. My phone buzzed once. A text from Margaret. Filed. You'll have service confirmation by end of day. I looked at the overpass. I thought about load distribution. I went back to work. Renee was served at 4:17 p.m. I know this because Margaret's office received confirmation and relayed it to me. I was in my car in the firm's parking lot when the call came. I thanked Margaret. I sat for a moment. I drove to a restaurant I had not been to in years. A quiet Italian place on Fifth Avenue where I used to eat alone when I was first rebuilding the house, before anyone else lived in it, and I ordered the thing I wanted and a glass of something good and I sat with it. The calls began at 5:30. Renee called 4 times in 40 minutes. I let them go to voicemail. Patricia called twice from a number I had never saved but recognized. I let those go as well. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner, alone, quiet, unhurried, was the first meal I had eaten in my own life in longer than I could precisely calculate. The legal process was, from my position, straightforward. Franklin County. No minor children. Joint property, jointly titled, but with a financial contribution record so asymmetrical that Margaret described our position as well supported. Ohio is not a community property state. It is an equitable distribution state, which means the court considers what is fair, and fair in this instance looked a great deal like the mortgage statements in my folder. But there was another piece. I had anticipated that Renee's position would hinge on the residence claim, the continuity of residence language I had heard her use in November. What I had done, in the months between overhearing that conversation and the filing, was document my own occupancy with meticulous care. Utility accounts in my name. Dated photographs of the basement workspace I had occupied. Email correspondence with neighbors timestamped across the relevant period. A letter from my firm confirming my registered home address on file. I had also done something Margaret called proactive and I called obvious. In December, 2 months before the filing, I had quietly retained a contractor to assess the property value and provide a formal improvement appraisal. The appraisal documented, line by line, the renovation work I had completed between 2009 and 2012. Foundation repair, kitchen reconstruction, electrical upgrade, custom millwork. When the contractor applied current material and labor rates to each improvement, the number was significant. What I had built, it turned out, was worth considerably more than what I had purchased. Margaret presented this appraisal in our first mediation session. Renee's attorney, a man named Garrett who wore the expression of someone who had been given insufficient information before walking into a room, looked at the document for a long time. He asked for a recess. In Ohio, mediation recesses are 15 minutes. Garrett was back in 22. He requested an adjournment to review the documentation. Margaret said that was fine. We scheduled a second session. Between the first and second sessions, something else happened. Margaret received a call from Garrett's office with a revised posture. The language of the conversation I had overheard, the residence claim, the documentation strategy, had been, apparently, based on counsel Renee had received from someone who was not a licensed attorney. Someone who had been watching television legal dramas and constructing a strategy from the scaffolding of half-understood procedure. Patricia, in other words, had been the architect of a plan built on bad information. I noted that the settlement was reached at the second mediation. The house was appraised. Given the improvement contribution record and the financial history, I received the property and assumed the remaining mortgage. A mortgage that, at this point, represented less than 22 of the home's assessed value. Renee received a cash settlement drawn from a joint account she had, notably, not moved or altered, presumably because she had expected to receive the house instead. She and Patricia vacated Ashford Lane on a Thursday in April. I stood in my kitchen, after the moving truck left. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat at my table. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was the specific, almost structural sensation of a load finally being distributed correctly, of weight returning to the beams designed to carry it. For the first 2 weeks after the house cleared, I did not answer a single call from any number associated with the previous chapter of my life. Renee called. Colleen called twice, with the careful energy of someone who had been asked to make a call she did not fully endorse. There were texts, some apologetic, some confused, one from Patricia that I read once and never opened again. The texts from Renee moved through recognizable stages. First, logistics, then frustration. Then, in week 3, something that might have been genuine reflection, though I have learned to be precise about the difference between reflection and strategy, and I was not certain which one I was reading. I responded to none of them. This is the part people misunderstand. They think the silence is anger. It is not anger. It is the absence of a role I no longer held. I had spent 11 years being the man in that house who smoothed things over, who fixed what broke, who absorbed what was handed to him without setting it back down. I was no longer that man. The silence was not a message. It was simply the sound of a position being vacated. I went to work. I came home. I fixed the water pressure in the upstairs shower, properly this time with the right parts, and I felt an almost embarrassing satisfaction in it. I reorganized the pantry. I returned the cast iron skillets. I rehung the architectural prints in the guest room. I did not feel lonely. This surprised me more than anything else. I had expected an absence, the specific hollowness of a house that has been emptied of people. What I found instead was that the house had been emptied of noise. What I had been living inside was not a family home. It had been, for at least 2 years, an occupied territory. And occupied territories, when finally cleared, do not feel empty. They feel like yours. One evening in late April, I sat on my back porch. A porch I had poured and framed and finished by hand in the summer of 2013, and I watched the light change over the yard. A neighbor walked his dog along the fence line. He waved. I waved back. What Renee and Patricia didn't know was that I had been building toward this particular evening my entire adult life. Not the divorce. Not the legal outcome. The porch, the quiet, the unthreatened cup of coffee, the right to exist in my own life without managing anyone's perception of it. I held on to that. The calls stopped coming around week 5. By week 6, the silence was mutual. I want to be careful here because thriving is a word that implies contrast, and I don't want to give the impression that what came next was a reaction to what came before. It wasn't. What came next was simply what had always been possible when the weight was correctly distributed. 6 weeks after the settlement, I was offered a senior partnership position at the firm. It had been in discussion for over a year. I know this now, but the timing of the offer was not lost on me. I had apparently become easier to be around. Colleagues mentioned it. My project manager said, at a dinner to mark the promotion, that I seemed lighter. I told him I'd fixed a drainage issue at home. He laughed. I was not entirely joking. The partnership came with an equity stake and a salary adjustment that represented a 34% increase over my previous compensation. I accepted on a Friday afternoon and drove home on empty roads with the windows down. That was month 2. In month 4, I bought the lake property. It was something I had wanted for years. A small parcel on Hoover Reservoir, about 40 minutes from Columbus. 2 acres. A dated but structurally sound cottage. A dock that needed work. The asking price was reasonable because the previous owners had deferred maintenance in ways that were cosmetic and visible and therefore frightening to buyers who didn't know what they were looking at. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I put in an offer the same week I saw it. I closed in 31 days. I spent the following 2 weekends replacing the dock decking and repainting the exterior trim. I did it alone in November in the cold, and I want you to understand that those were 2 of the best weekends of my adult life. In month 7, a former colleague, a man named Terrence who had left the firm 3 years prior to start a private structural consulting practice, called me with a proposal. He had more contract work than his team could absorb and wanted to know if I would consider a joint venture arrangement on a series of commercial appraisal contracts. We drafted a simple partnership agreement. The first contract was signed in January. By month 12, that partnership had generated $94,000 in consulting revenue above my base salary. In month 14, I refinanced the house on Ashford Lane. The new appraisal, completed by the same contractor who had appraised the improvements for the mediation, came in at a number that made the original 2009 purchase price look like a misprint. I pulled equity. I used it to complete the lake cottage renovation. The lake cottage, by month 18, had been appraised at a value 60 above my acquisition cost. In month 16, I took a trip I had been postponing for 11 years. 2 weeks in Portugal, Porto, the Douro Valley, Lisbon. I stayed in quiet hotels. I ate at unhurried restaurants. I walked for hours in cities where no one knew me and no one needed anything from me, and the light came in at angles I had never seen before.
Isen no postcards.
I took many photographs. I came home with the specific, unnameable quality that comes from having spent time entirely inside your own life. What Renee and Patricia didn't know, what they could not have known because they had never understood what they were dealing with, was that the version of me they had tried to diminish was not my ceiling. It was my floor. People ask me, occasionally, carefully, the way people ask things they're not sure they're entitled to ask, whether I regret the years. The 11 years of dinners I cooked and gutters I cleaned and cars I repaired for people who were, it turns out, mapping the exits while I was reinforcing the walls. I tell them, no. And I mean it in the way you mean something when you've thought about it long enough to no longer need to defend it. Here is what I believe, and I want to say it as precisely as I can, because imprecision is a disservice to anyone who has lived something like this. The years were not wasted. The years were investment in a version of yourself that the wrong room could not see. Every repair I made, every dinner I cooked, every unreturned courtesy. That was not loss. That was evidence. That was documentation. That was the folder I brought to Margaret Foss's office on a Thursday morning. And that folder was the entire game. What Renee and Patricia didn't know, what people who underestimate composed men almost never know, is that quiet men keep records. Not out of suspicion, not out of strategy, but because a man who has built things with his hands understands, at a cellular level, that the work is in the foundation. That what you cannot see is what holds everything up. I didn't know it yet, but I was always going to be fine. Not because I was special, not because I was lucky, but because I never stopped building even when I was building in a basement. They handed me a key to my own lower floor and thought they were diminishing me. They were showing me exactly how much room I had left. The composed man does not perform strength. He simply continues. He fixes the water pressure. He files the documents. He finishes the dock in November. And when the right moment comes, not the dramatic moment, not the cinematic moment, but the precise, quiet, irreversible moment, he redistributes the load. And then he drives to the lake. If the story found you tonight, it found you for a reason. You've been patient. You've been present. You've been pouring coffee in rooms that don't see you, and somewhere in the last 35 minutes you felt something you maybe haven't felt in a while. That's not nostalgia. That's recognition. Subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Hit the notification bell. Because every week we sit down with another composed man, another builder, another carrier of weight, and we watch what happens when he finally stops performing patience. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit different. I'll be reading.